Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our third Psychosocial Wednesday of 2024. Today is a special day, a special date. First of all, because next month will be our 5th anniversary, our 5th birthday. So join us again next month. But today, we do something very special. We have a book launch. Until today, Psychosocial Wednesday organized book launches for books published by other publishing houses, our dear Routledge, Chiron, and so on and so forth. But today, we present our first in-house published book. And this is a miracle. This is a true miracle for different reasons. It's not the first of the series. You know about the series Recovered in Analytical Psychology. The first book was Verena Kath, the second Polly Young-Eisendrath. They were published by Chiron. But this time we did everything in-house. I want to thank Mansasvara, who produced the book, inside, outside, Nico Krevich, who also helped the book, and the team, Ludmilla, Chiara, Mikal, Kathleen. Why is the publication of this book so relevant? For two reasons. Because the idea I had a few years ago about JUNGIANEUM is really taking shape. What does it mean? This book usually, if you buy it from a normal publisher, costs minimum 30–40 euros. Actually, we were able to produce this so that you can buy it for 15 euros, $20. Actually, until this weekend, we decided to lower even more the price. So if you buy it today, tomorrow, Friday, and if you buy it from Europe, you will pay 12 euros, which is nothing, or $15. Why am I underlining this? First, because I want you to buy the book so that Mary will be happy. And we already sold 41. It's amazing. It's out since 2 weeks. We sold 41 books. But it's good because books, especially our books, are too expensive. We, the JUNGIANEUM gang, wants to work to republish or publish books that are affordable worldwide. Of course, $15 in the US is nothing. But what about in other countries? So we're really, really working hard to keep the price down. For those that are new to this platform, let me share with you what is JUNGIANEUM. JUNGIANEUM is an idea that I started in 2022, JUNGIANEUM Contemporary Initiative for Analytical Psychology and Neo-Jungian Studies. Under this umbrella, we are developing a series of initiatives like this one, Recovered in Analytical Psychology, so newly recovered. In summer, we will have a very, very interesting book by our colleague Pia Skogaman titled Waxing Femininity. And then next year, we will have John Beebe with a psychiatric book. But apart from this, we organize, of course, Psychosocial Wednesday, like today. Every Wednesday, we invite an important Jungian, ex-Jungian, former Jungian, post-Jungian, neo-Jungian. We also work on another book that is called The Yearbook. This yearbook is about past year. We're working on the number 2 issue, so also very important to bring something new. And many initiatives like conferences, hopefully soon. And we do this to keep Jung thinking alive and to bring neo-Jungian spirit, which is very, very important to us. Now, coming to tonight, Mary Watkins, Open to the Imaginal, Waking Dreams, and Invisible Guest. You're here for Mary. She's fantastic author, fantastic teacher. People love her all around the world, especially from Pacifica, where she is Professor Emerita at the Pacifica Graduate Institute. She co-founded its MA PhD Depth Psychology program, the Community, Liberation, Indigenous, and Eco-Psychologies specialization, and the Community and Ecological Fieldwork and Research curriculum. She's the author of mutual accompaniment and the creation of the commons, walking dreams, invisible guests, which are the two texts included in this new book, and many, many, many other books. Mary, welcome. Can someone unmute Mary, please? Mary, okay.
I got it.
Welcome.
Well, first, I want to thank you. I want to thank Stefano. And Stefano, I loved your choice of the word curate for your role in this production. We know that it comes from the Latin care, to be a guardian, a curator. And I really appreciate your reaching back to this early part of my work and bringing it up into the present. And thank you to the team that helped Stefano with this, and also to Dennis Rivers, who did the original scanning earlier on for human development books. And I see so many of my former students. Thank you for coming. It's very, very sweet.
Mary, before I have a few questions for you. Do you remember when I invited you to be part of my book, The New Ancestors, and you had to write about yourself? How would you describe yourself? Who is Mary Watkins?
On which dimension are you thinking?
You can choose.
Well, there are many dimensions, right? So I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a great-grandmother, I'm a teacher. But I must say that writing has been something that's really been consistently present in my life, particularly since I was 19. I'm always working on a book. I think in book-length terms, I'm happy when I'm learning and researching to be able to write something. And teaching has been very important in my trying out the ideas that I'm writing. They're kind of formative to the writing process. So I feel very blessed that I'm a person who has loved to read, really from whenever I started. It's like a very sweet thing in my life. And yeah, so that's a start.
Thanks. I remember when I was working on my PhD, and Professor Andrew Samuels, suggested me to look at your work. And I was fascinated by the concept of liberation and how you work with it. And in my own PhD thesis and the new book that I will publish in summer with Routledge, Absolute Freedom is the title, I really employ your work. And I felt you accompanied me throughout my PhD and forging even this idea of absolute freedom that really is liberation in the 21st centuries. So this is what I remember of you, the first arising of you in my life through your books suggested by Andrew Samuels. But when we look at your book, Opening to the Imaginal, Waking Dreams and Invisible Guests, how do you remember the imaginal first arising in your life?
Well, I think that this is a question that we could all focus on as we launch into this conversation, because we each have very intimate relationships with the imaginal when we're young, and in many cases, it seems as though we outgrow it, and then it becomes a problem of how to reignite our relationship. But I must thank my mother, who welcomed. I had an imaginary companion, and my mother would welcome her to the dining room table. She would have a seat, a plate, and could be a presence. I was a pretty shy child, very introverted, as you can imagine. Always had a best friend, and my friend Diane and I, we would have really very lengthy scenarios with our dolls. There was a particular place I remember in my childhood school playground that was sort of a group of bushes that had a little space in the middle, that my friends and I could pretend that we were playing house, and had a lot of scenarios unfold there. the imaginal was quite close. I love to think about different kinds of futures. Would I sing in Broadway? Would I be a missionary? What would I do with my life? And I was also brought up, within a church, and so praying was also something that was really instilled at a young age as well. So those are some of the ways, and I offer that you think about how it first came up for you.
Mary, you started working on waking dreams very early. First, when part of your thesis, as your thesis at Princeton University, and later you revised it while you were studying at the Carl Gustav Jung Institute, where you run away from it, right? I want to hear that story. What happened in your life that began your writing, working dreams at such an early age?
Yeah, so I was a junior in college, and my father was ill. Then my mother was diagnosed with cancer. There were lots of stressors going on, and I found that I began to fall into a depression. And as I did that, the veil between the conscious and the unconscious, if you will, got quite thin. So that I was aware that as I would like take a nap, and when you're studying text in college, often taking naps happens quite frequently. The imaginal was kind of rising up. Images were very ready to hand, both as I was going to sleep, as I was waking up. And then many, many dreams started to come, very vivid. I could remember them in a lot of detail. And I began to get like super curious. Well, what is this? What's going on here? I was aware of the prejudices in the culture about that kind of imaginal eruption. So I began to look into it. How had other people experienced this kind of thing? How did other cultures think about it? And I realized pretty soon that given that I had to write a senior thesis, I better write about what was happening. Not, of course, at that time, you couldn't say you're writing about it because it's happening to you. But I could approach it from a kind of multidisciplinary set of lenses to try to look at what are waking dreams? And what are these dialogues that begin to spontaneously happen that are quite different from hallucinations, but very vivid and meaningful nonetheless? So I wrote my senior thesis, and I had been working at the Dream Lab at Maimonides Hospital in Brooklyn with a man named Stanley Krippner, whom I'm sure many of you have heard about. And he happened to be on a publishing board for Gordon and Breach Science Publisher. So one day I got a letter from them saying they would like to publish this book. I was so surprised because I hadn't even submitted it. And then a couple of years later, David Miller, part of the Archetypal Psychology group, was able to get it published through Harper and Row. And so this early book got a fair amount of traction. Although I'll tell you a funny story, which was when I went to New York to meet with the editor at Harper and Row, Hugh Van Dusen. I was very excited. I was 22 years old, and I was thinking, well, maybe I had a path into writing. Maybe I could do what I really wanted to do, which was to read and write. And I brought this up with him at lunch, and he shook his head and he said, no, you have to focus on getting a day job. So that sent me even further into psychology and ultimately clinical work and teaching.
I mean, aren't we lucky that we can spend our days reading, writing, but especially thinking? Plus, if we are working with patients, really is really a dream job if we can use that phrasing. How did your discovering Jung's work affect your study of the imaginal?
Well, I was very lucky at that time. Now we're talking about 1970 to 1972 when I was at Princeton. The department was completely experimental, except for one person, Henry Reed, who was a young professor, and he was in love with Jung. And so he introduced me to Jung, and I can remember exactly where I was laying on a couch in the psychology reading room one Sunday afternoon when I got to the 6th chapter in the autobiography, Confrontations with the Unconscious. And there, he's describing exactly what I'm going through, which was his being pulled into active imagination after his break with Freud, and the way that he decided to not struggle against it, but to go with it, to be curious about it, and to do the deep learning that he did over decades from his own active imagination. So I felt fortified, encouraged, and supported by Jung's work. And I figured that I wanted to go into Jungian analysis. I wrote a letter to Esther Harding, who had written The Way of All Women. And right the month I was graduating, the letter was returned. Having been in circulation for about 5 months, she had just passed. But I was able to work with a Jungian for a year before I decided to go to the Jung Institute.
We will get to that in a moment. But first, I mean, those years were seminal. 1970s, 1980s, Jung died in the 61. So it was really moving from Jung to the Zurich school or the classical school. But also what then was termed archetypal school was emerging with the work of Hillman. What led you to study James Hillman's work as you were finishing your waking dreams?
Yeah, well, when I graduated from Princeton, I was very enamored by the work of R.D. Laing, and I moved to a therapeutic community where half of the people were there were young people who were coming out of McLean Hospital and other hospitals, and the other half of us were kind of accompaniers with different tasks. My task was to cook for everybody every night, but I didn't make any money doing that. So I also had a job nights at Cambridge City Hospital that had a psychiatric wing and a psychiatric emergency room. So one night I was working there and doing rounds and checking on the people who were suicidal. And I walked into the room of a teacher who was in the midst of committing suicide. And being 22 years old myself, it was quite a frightening situation. I intervened. She survived. And that morning I had an analytic hour with my Jungian analyst and Davida Tenenbaum. And she said, you really must read James Hillman's Suicide and the Soul. I had never heard of James Hillman up to that point. And so I started trying to find the book. It had been stolen from 6 libraries in Boston. Finally, a book arrived through interlibrary loan. And toward the middle of the book, I became a real fan of Hillman. Because toward the middle of the book, he does this really radical thing, I think, which is he says, when people are in the throes of suicidal thinking and fantasizing, the clinicians try to distract them into topics that have more to do with life and living. They think somehow that if you follow the imagery of what the person is experiencing, that's somehow encouraging their movement towards suicide. And he said, by not following it, you're actually disregarding where the life energy is in them at that particular moment, in that particular part of their life, that the images, even though they might be quite disturbing, is where the psychic energy is. And so get curious and allow the person to tell you and to follow out the pathway of those images as they're unfolding. And that's what I had been kind of discovering on my own, because during that time, there were many people approaching waking dreams in Europe and in the US who were trying to direct them, doing things that were called guided imagery. They would select the images that people should be fantasizing about. They had preferred scenarios about how the interactions with the images should go. And in essence, allowing the ego, both of the guided imagery expert and of the person, to really have full reign over the imaginal. And so Jung had been encouraging me, and then Hillman deepening, that in a way the ego had to get out of the way, that the ego itself could be taken as a character among other characters. That was particularly Hillman's idea. And that fascinated me, because then that meant that one could take a critical approach to the ego. You could wonder, well, where did this kind of ego come from? What co-constructed it in this particular way? So I decided I really wanted to work with Jim Hillman. So I get to Zurich, and I'd use my very bad German, and I figure out how to use a payphone, and I call him up, and a woman answers and says, "Oh, he's gone to Yale to get the Terry lectures. He'll be back in 4 or 5 months." Well, it turns out that my husband now, Ed Casey, was the one hosting him at Yale. But it meant that I never had James Hillman as a therapist. But when he got back, we had some very lucky meetings, and he was the one who first published my first piece of my first writing, which was a chapter in this book, Waking Dreams. And from that point, we became very close friends, and I count him as one of the most significant mentors in my life.
Absolutely. I mean, he was the mentor for many, and without Hillman, I always say there would be possibly no analytical psychology as we know it today. He was really the one to put Jung into the map after Jung. Otherwise,
Yes.
the Zurich Leute, the Zurich people would have been in a very Swiss way, just
Yes.
Swiss. So we have to be really thankful to him, and then for everything he did. I mean, he's recognized as one, if not the most important psychologist of the late 20th century, American psychology of the 20th century.
Yes.
So we're lucky to have him as a Jungian or a post-Jungian. How did you engage, or how did Invisible Guest come about?
Yeah, well, I went from the Jung Institute to Duquesne to study phenomenological psychology. While I was
finished Zurich, right? You ran away.
Yeah, I ran away after a year. So I had the generation of people who had learned from Jung, people like Barbara Hanna and Marie-Louise von Franz, but then others as well. And it was actually before Hillman came, a rather stultifying environment. It was not a very generative intellectual place, and it was very much against looking at other approaches. So I was at the same time studying particularly Medard Boss's work. Medard Boss had worked with Jung for a long time, many years, in an interpretation of dreams group. And I found that his book, Interpretation of Dreams, was really like probably, of course, it came before Hillman, but it was a beautiful exposition of a very similar approach to what Hillman was doing. And so that led me into phenomenology. I went to Duquesne for a year, got a master's there, and then I was looking for graduate PhD programs, and discovered the work of Bernard Kaplan at Clark University. And Bernie was a developmental psychologist who was also really a philosopher. And he was very keen on looking at the underlying ideologies in psychological theorizing and experimentation. And so in looking at developmental psychology, he was able to teach people like Piaget in a very different way, because he would start with what was Piaget's highest value? Okay, well, it was the development of abstract thought. So then was what he discovered as he looked at his own children, who were the subjects for all of his theorizing, was he discovering this primacy of abstract thought in our lives, or was he taking examples from his children's lives to show what he would believe to be the best trajectory if you wanted to develop abstract thinking? So Bernie argued the latter. And so he said, well, why then not couldn't you start with professing the value that you hold rather than having it be undisclosed, and begin to build a developmental pathway to encourage the kind of being in the world that you see as advantageous. And so in this way, it opened a whole different way of thinking about the development of imaginal dialogues than what was being presented in developmental psychology, which was primarily that they were usurped by abstract thinking, that the characters of childhood play were homogenized into some kind of a generalized other in our thinking, and that to preserve imaginal dialogues would be actually a kind of return to a sort of primitive thinking, and perhaps even encouraging certain forms of psychopathology. So Bernie encouraged me to look at what were the values that were undergirding psychological theories that really disparaged imaginal dialogues. And then what I was doing was taking poets and novelists, people who had deep spiritual commitments to prayer, etc., who were actively involved in imaginal dialogues, and was seeking to understand how they had retrieved their connection to the imaginal and were able to really have it be a cornerstone of their life and not a sign of psychopathology or primitivity or childishness.
So interesting. It's also interesting for me what you said about keeping the dogma in Zurich after Jung's death. So I wonder whether you also faced resistance when you start working on these exceptional themes. But before to get into that, what were some of the things you were trying to accomplish in your work, Invisible Guests?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to, this is why the volume is called Opening to the Imaginal. I wanted to open a space within psychology where the imaginal was seen as a value throughout life, and not just as something that children do, or that is something people who are schizophrenic are involved with in terms of hallucinations. But to say, look, this is a resource that we all have available in our lives. And if we are able to discern how these kind of ways of thinking about thought have corralled the imagination, we can begin to retrieve it and to really be educated by the multiplicity of the psyche, and not just, kind of be in an ego-driven kind of what Hillman would call a heroic ego stance. I also thought it had benefits for psychotherapy, that there were ways to do almost like internal family systems therapy by attention to the characters that come up in your thinking. Thinking in essence is dialogical. We think so quickly that it becomes rather elliptical. That is, we only catch snatches. But if we slow our thinking down, we hear our mother's voice, we hear our teacher's voice, we're talking with our brother. There's an ideal self over there that is discouraging us. So in psychotherapy, you can slow the situation down to when a person presents, say, a fear or an anxiety. You know, who is anxious? What do they want to say? Who else is present? Where is this taking place? So to use the nightly dream as a sort of pattern to know that when there's an imaginal voice, there's also often others present. There's a place. There's a set of actions, and that one can be in reciprocal relationship in order to be able to unearth what's actually happening. So I tried to, at the end of the book, give some examples of that, but also to be clear about differentiating it from what we called hallucinations, because oftentimes what I was trying to encourage was a dialogical approach. So not just like listening to characters speak to us, but also speaking back and listening back and forth. In hallucination, often what's going on is there's a voice of command that's telling a person what to do. Jump out the window, for instance, or you must kill yourself, or command. This isn't always the case, but this is the problematic set of auditory hallucinations, which are in essence monological. They're one-sided. There isn't a space for the response. The person is overwhelmed by the command. So these are really two very different things that need to be distinguished in order to be able to help people not be afraid to engage with their abandoned child or a voice of wisdom that's coming in, etc.
The more I hear what you say, I think of you as a neo-Jungian ante litteram instead of a post-Jungian, and actually not even a Jungian de jure, no? You didn't finish the training, but really my idea of neo-Jungian is our generation, the generation that started after the death of Jim Hillman, that really comes to Jung after having studied in depth other fields. Instead, the post-Jungians went into other fields from Jung. So it's
Yes.
really bringing richness to the world, and what you bring to the Jungian field, although are you post-Jungian, a Jungian, a neo-Jungian, I don't know, who cares? But it's so enriching, but also problematic, I would say. Did you?
And why is that?
Because then I come to the next question. Did you find difficulties, resistance to your early work when it was presented to the wider Jungian audience?
I did feel I did have some resistance to my work. I'll give you 3 instances. I can remember being at a dinner party in Boston after these 2 books were published, and a Jungian analyst came up to me, and I didn't even know him. This was the first thing he says to me: "You're breaking the rule." I said, "What's the rule?" Also, I should have asked, "Well, who are you? Could we say hello to each other?" "You're breaking the rule." "What's the rule?" "You are not allowed to do active imagination in the session. Jung said so." Okay, so Jung had said the active imagination was something that he helped people learn to do on their own toward the end of analysis so that they could carry on the analytic process. I was welcoming people to speak and to hear from characters within their therapeutic situation, but I was not guiding them. Jung was afraid that the analysts would impose their own values on the active imagination, and he wanted it to somehow be more purely emerging. But what he didn't give room for was the way in which another person's presence holds open a psychosocial space for the imaginal to arise. And by another person being there, it needn't be an analyst or a therapist, another person being carefully attentive and witnessing, one can actually hold attention better on the imaginal, because otherwise oftentimes the imaginal flits here and there, right? Also, when there's something very deeply disturbing that the person's working on, to have another person with them is a form of accompaniment. So that was one criticism. I had broken a rule. The second came from the head of the clinic at Clark, where I was doing, training, who knew about the first book. I hadn't written the second book yet. And he thought that if you asked a person a question like, who is it in you who's so afraid of doing well at school, because we were seeing students, that was encouraging schizophrenia. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so far from encouraging schizophrenia. It's unbelievable. But that was a prejudice. And that one, like many interns, you have to end up doing therapy the best you can. And so you end up knowing what not to tell your supervisor, right? Unfortunately. The third instance was some years later. I was asked to see a very young woman who was having her first break. She was in the psychiatric wing at the hospital, and she was just having kind of in constant delusions, and they were very terrifying to her. And I was asked by her parents to visit with her, and I would ask her, what was happening and what the voices were saying. And her psychiatrist, hearing of this, said that was very, very bad move, because what we should be doing is not asking her anything about the delusions or the voices, but trying to bring her back to reality. Now, the problem is that this is where she was living. And so when nobody was talking to her about what she was actually experiencing, she was completely alone, completely, except for what was being done to her through the delusions. So there were these kinds of confusions, I would say, about different kinds of imaginal experience that really needed to be carefully differentiated. And I've tried to do that as best I can.
It's interesting, those that can only follow their teachers, being orthodox, and those actually that bring the field forward, and for these are brave and take risks, but very often we're scolded, especially when they are young. Let's change the topic from this orthodoxy. Because then there is a new step in your career, in your knowledge, in your studies. In the early 80s, you began to explore social issues. This is why I like your work so much. It's not just the soul, the images, but really social issues, really, as we would say now, psychosocial. So you explore social issues through an imaginal lens. Tell us about some of the early work at the interface between the imaginal and social justice and peace issues, which is something that always come back. We all want peace. Peace never comes. It's impossible, right?
I hope not.
I hope not too.
Well, in the early 80s, I began to have nuclear nightmares. This was a time in Boston. I was living in Boston. Helen Caldecott, the Australian doctor, was there heading and founding Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I realized that up to that point, I had kept my library in 3 sections: psychology, really social justice and peace issues, and spiritual issues. And that these eruptions of dreams were really like asking for the psychology and the social and the cultural to come together. And I was reading the work at the time of Robert J. Lifton. His book, Nazi Doctors, I think, was presenting this idea of psychic numbing, where with a particular issue that's traumatizing, he was dealing with ones in the past, like what people experienced in Hiroshima, but also could be the trauma that one experiences when perpetrates trauma, as in the Nazi doctors, or perhaps even I was thinking trauma that hasn't yet happened, like nuclear war. Psychic numbing was a theory saying that a part of us knows full well the situation, and another part of us pretends that it isn't so. And so we're unable to galvanize our action around the particular social issue that we're most concerned about, because we're in this bind. And so I remember in 1981, I think it was, there was Hillman had a conference at University of San Francisco, and I had a workshop where I asked people to identify the part of themselves that was very afraid of nuclear war and was quite aware of the imminent danger of it at that moment, and the part of themselves that didn't want to hear anything about it, and have a kind of imaginal dialogue between those two parts. And the interesting thing was no one could fail to identify these two aspects of themselves and to experience them as characters in a novel, as you might say. And so I began to use that approach around a number of issues when I found the work of a Quaker sociologist named Elise Boulding, who was teaching at Dartmouth. She had been the translator of Francis Pollock's work in Europe called The Image of the Future. After the Second World War, Pollock had realized that many people in Europe were so demoralized by the war that they no longer had a viable image for the future they wanted their societies to move toward. And so he had begun to mobilize groups of people to begin to image the future. And she took this work and began to use it in peace work by asking people, let's imagine that in 30 years, we have been able to have the abolition of nuclear weapons. What would it look like? And people would share their images of this more utopic future in 30 years. And then they would work backwards in 5-year periods into the present. What would need to happen in the next 5 years? What would you need to do in the next year of your life if you wanted to be on the path to seeing these more utopic images embodied? And I began to realize, and in those meetings, people had very, very strong feelings about the kinds of social situations they most desired to live in. And what struck me was that in individual psychotherapy, nobody ever brought those things up. They never talked about the kinds of schools they really wished they had, or the kinds of town meetings, or the approaches to anti-racism, or whatever. It was all very much individualized, privatized, focus on the self. And so I realized that there were these unspoken rules that were governing psychotherapy and analytic sessions about what was supposed to be really meaningful when we talk about the psychological dimension of life, but it was leaving out so much of what we go through in what I will call the eco-psychosocial dimension, including the ecological, that actually forms us and is a part of our everyday experience. So this alerted me that the imagination didn't need to be segregated into a more individualistic, privatistic sort of examination of a self that's narrowly derived from relations with parents and a few local others. But we could really like move from an individualistically oriented self to seeing a paradigm of the self that we could call interdependent, where where we would acknowledge that there is a free flow from the social to the psychic, from the ecological to the psychic, that the borders that we erected, partly in a disciplinary fashion, are really counterproductive to our understanding the multidimensionality of how we actually co-arise with each other.
Yeah. And then Paulo Freire appeared in your life, the Brazilian
Yes.
pedagogue, had a large impact on the direction of your work. What was the resonance you discovered between opening to the imaginal
Yeah.
and Freire's work with groups? And even more, how did your study of colonialism affect your understanding of Jungian and archetypal psychology?
Lots of questions there. Okay, so I was beginning to want to form a family through adoption. And so I was assigned a little baby from Northeast Brazil. I didn't know anything about Northeast Brazil. I began to eat Northeast Brazilian food, read Northeast Brazilian poetry, and found the work of Paulo Freire. So this was in 1984. And when I found the work of Paulo Freire, I really felt it was the missing half of depth psychology, because Freire was informed by many psychoanalytic thinkers, but he was working in a very different context in Northeast Brazil, and was working with groups of people, trying to involve them in a methodology that, if we simplify it, has two parts. The first he called conscientization. So when people would identify a problem, they would try to bring the understanding that was in the room about the problem, share that. So it was quite dialogical, but try to understand how those problems had been constructed. Let's say not having enough to eat in a particular region. What had happened historically to bring that into account? Had it always been that way? Had it ever been different? What did people know about it? And then once people could understand how the present situation had come into effect, come into being, what the factors were that co-created it, then they could begin to imagine, how would they want it to be otherwise? What would it look like if there was ample food? How would that come about? How would it be sustained? What changes in governance would need to happen? What changes in ownership of land would need to happen, et cetera? And in this second process, which he called annunciation, was really a process of prophetic imagination. So it was very akin to what Elise Boulding was doing in terms of having people be able to see that the situation in which they was in wasn't inevitable. It was created. It was created for certain ends. And when you understand what those ends are, you have some leverage, if you're working with other people, to begin to change the situation and move it toward more optimal ways of being. So I saw resonances between that and Jungian work and Hillmanian work. Conscientization seemed to me quite akin to individuation. Individuation, in some places, Jung talks about it as beginning to see what are the prevalent cultural norms that you've identified with, that you've taken for granted. Try to see what they are, and then evaluate, do you actually want to be identified with these, or with other ways of being? so that the identification isn't unconscious, where we just replicate the status quo with how our self is constructed. And as I said, enunciation had aspects of active imagination with it. They were both involved with liberation, but in very, very different but intersecting ways. So if we began to see that the psychic space and social space are actually connected, then is it possible for an individual to become liberated while still oppressing others? Freire would say liberation is a social act. It's not just an individual act. And so that has consequences then when we're working in a privatized, individualistic way. How do we take some of the things that we're learning in terms of openness to multiplicity, a bracketing of the heroic ego? How do we take those propensities that we're kind of tutoring in ourselves to also allow that to be the case when we're interacting with other human beings, when we're acting in concert with other than human animals or the natural world? So I saw that some of the things that I think Jung was trying to do to heal what we might call a colonial ego were needed not only at the intrapsychic level, but the interpersonal level, the intercultural level, and the ecological level. So colonialism, I began to see more clearly through the lens of Freire and then Frantz Fanon, Martin Barreau in El Salvador and others. And just as I had, you know, in the late 1980s, I had begun to see that all the object relations theories and analytic theories that I had learned had the paradigm of individualism underneath them. And object relations obviously had also the paradigm of the nuclear family that was unquestioned, right? So what I was beginning to see in the late 1980s, early 1990s was that colonialism was this unspoken ghost in all these depth psychological theories that we were all learning and replicating, but it wasn't being talked about. So if we think about a colonial ego or heroic imperial ego as one who sees others and oneself within a hierarchy, supposes oneself superior to others, although then obviously has narcissistic difficulties, because if you're always trying to conceive of yourself as superior, you're going to be afraid about finding yourself inferior. The whole ego want to be in control and in mastery, to be centered and not decentered, that these propensities actually are akin to the ways that countries that became colonial powers treated other countries in terms of taking away the resources, marginalizing the people, taking control and mastery, presuming oneself superior, non-primitive, others as primitive, uncivilized, etc. And so if that's the case, which I think it's you can see very clear parallels, then Jung was in his own way, when he was treating, white, upper class and upper middle class Europeans and Americans, was trying to deal with this ego that had gotten out of control and that had been constellated through a whole history of colonialism, capitalism, and racism. So, but he didn't think about it really in that way. I don't think he presented it in that way. And once we do see it in that light, then we have to think about what's the sociocultural, economic, and political context that creates the kind of egos that are problematic both to themselves and to other people. And that yes, we can try within the context of psychotherapy to change how we're moving in the world in relation to others and to ourselves. But we also have to think about the wider context and how it's generating, through education, through housing, through economic arrangements, etc. Through white privilege, the kinds of egos that we have. And I think back to the phenomenologist Vandenberg. He said that the masterful ego that wants to be in control, that emerges out of the beginnings of industrialization and capitalism, co-constellated the dynamic unconscious. That it's not mysterious that they occur at the same time, because the ego is trying to separate itself from so much. But then the problem is we get into such a small, tight ring of being that has, chopped off other people, other ways of being, the natural world, that we end up in a state of poverty, even though we may have accumulated, in the ego's terms, quite a lot.
Wow. Simple question, an amazing answer.
They're hard questions.
Before we open the floor to people, I have a couple of questions, but at the end of the day, this is a book launch. So imagine if now you go on Amazon, if you're in the US, Amazon.com, if you're in Switzerland, on the Swiss Amazon, Italy, England, and buy the book. We are 60. Imagine if you all buy the book. Really, we are going to get 1 cent for each book because we put the price so lower, but it would be nice to sell 100 copies within a month. Right, Mary? Let's be a bit sadistic. A bit. We put so much work for free. Couple of more questions from my side, and I really want to open the floor. But there is so much to ask, and we could go on. Turn of the century, in your 2000 essay on the liberation of being, big thing, liberation of being, you wrote about some of the commonalities between active imagination, free association, Reichian work, Winnicottian work. Can you tell us what you saw and how this was important, both intrapsychically and personally? By the way, don't forget to buy the book on Amazon.
And also, if you go to my website, which is mary-watkins.net, these essays are there. And this one is a particular favorite of mine. So, I begin, back when I was writing these books, being very involved with the imaginal. And as time goes by, I'm experiencing other forms of therapy myself. I went into Reichian therapy as well. I'm beginning to think that that the principal thing wasn't the imaginal per se. It was the opening that was really important. And in fact, there are several places in Jung where he talks about that in many instances, you don't have to go through amplifying the images that come out of active imagination. You don't have to put them through some interpretive mill. It's the experience itself. And when I looked at free association, which requires the free arising of thoughts, and then Reichian work, getting to a place where you could allow feelings in your body to freely arise. Or Winnicottian therapy, where Winnicott had these wonderful, 3-hour sessions sometimes where a person would lie on the ground, and if they wanted to move, they would move. If they wanted to speak, they would speak. If images came, they would speak them. But there wasn't a goal of any particular content. the goal was to allow the free arising of being. And when I got to that idea, I realized that that's actually also what's very precious in our relationships with other people, in our relationships with nature, that regardless of what our role is with respect to others, that if we take the word presence seriously, it involves a kind of bracketing of egoic concern, a decentering of the self, allowing the other, be it imaginal or actual other, to unfold in the way that they want to unfold. That doesn't mean that we can't ask curious, generative questions, but we're not trying to like alter their emergence. And so I saw that this was also the case in certain group processes. David Bohm's work with groups, that's based on Krishnamurti's work, also in some of the work of Patrick Demare with in large dialogue groups. So that opened me up to an idea that I was focusing on for the last 10 years, which is the idea of eco-psychosocial accompaniment. That in accompaniment, you know, if a person or situation asks for your accompaniment, you don't arrive, as Freire would say, in a culturally invasive mode, i.e. knowing the answers to the situation before you even know the people there, or you even know how they formulated the questions for themselves. You arrive with curiosity and openness. And I think in what I'm calling eco-psychosocial, you're arriving with a readiness to listen to the contributions of those various domains, the psychological, the social, the ecological, to what's going on in the present.
And if you allow me to add something, I truly believe that accompaniment, especially accompaniment of the soul, psychagogia, as
Yes.
We could say, is 21st century psychoanalysis, especially if you look at the traditional embedded word in the family, in society, in the class, where Jung and Freud grew up, and that word is gone, is a global word, but there is a need for accompaniment of the soul that has been lost because these changes in society. So before you had problems, you were looking, tell me about your mom, tell me about your dad. Now mom and dad are not there, are ectoplasm in a way. So there is a new way of accompaniment. It's actually very much what you say.
Yeah, so we could think about that early work as my learning, how was I to accompany myself, right? Yeah. How was I to welcome the multiplicity of psyche? Yeah. But you know, people start at different places. Some people may start in a much more extroverted place with how do I open to other people? But you know, ultimately the task, I think, for me has been how to be present. You know?
I think that the job of a psychoanalyst starts from there, you know, self-analyzing, self-understanding, self-accompaniment, self-reflection.
Yes. Yeah.
One more question before we open the floor to our guests. You just retired from Pacifica. You are emeritus or professor emerita. Otherwise, my old Latin friends would not be happy. You created a community and ecological fieldwork and research portion of the curriculum. In what ways was this influenced by what you discovered tracking the imaginal across the various domains we have talked about?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I had gone to Pacifica thinking that I was going to be teaching in the clinical program, but They first needed me to chair the counseling program, so I did that for 3 years. And then there were senior members who were interested in forming a depth program that didn't have a clinical purpose. People weren't being trained to be clinicians, and they wanted me to be part of that. But I'm a pretty practical person. I didn't see why we would learn everything about depth psychology historically, but not have any way of practicing it. And so I proposed that there be a part of the program where people could attend to their dreams, their active imaginations, what pulled them in the newspaper, what pulled them in their communities, to try to figure out what of the world was actually asking for their attention, and could they find a place within their own community or another community to apprentice to this issue, and hopefully learn from community workers, cultural workers who were already there, and to hold depth psychology here and what they were experiencing there, and see if there were any threads of connection, because it seemed like there's psychological level of being every place we go, in schools, ecological centers, restorative justice, because we're human beings, right? So people would be involved in that over the course of their years as a student, and then oftentimes their dissertation work would take up the area that they had apprenticed themselves to. So we had literally, at this point, thousands of different kinds of projects that people entered into, primarily in a dialogical way, and when research was involved, primarily in participatory action research. So not coming to kind of use the community for one's research, hopefully, but if the community had particular research interest, how to partner with them to address those questions. And I think it then morphed into the Community Liberation, Indigenous, and Eco-Psychology's MA PhD program, where we had more curricular time to actually help students learn how to do all these things, and more support for their involvement.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor to questions. Please raise your electronic hand, not the real hand, the electronic hand. I see Brett as a question. Can you unmute yourself, or do we need to unmute you?
I believe I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
Hi, Mary, former
Oh,
student
good to
of
see you.
yours here.
Yes.
I really appreciated your differentiation between hallucination and other experiences of the imaginal. And you painted hallucination, described hallucination as being very monological, and often the voice is a commanding voice, and contrasting that with a more dialogical experience of the imagination or the imaginal. And I'm wondering if you've witnessed people move from one to the other, move from having hallucinations to being able to engage in dialogue with what had been previously just a hallucination. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. I'm remembering a psychoanalyst in Boston named Havens, who said, most hallucinations we never need to worry about. It's only when they become problematic that we really hear about them. And so many hallucinations that people have can be quite positive. They're going out to dance tonight with somebody they really want to go dancing with, etc. But when they are problematic, that's these particularly monological ones. But there is a group called Hearing Voices that has started and is now in many, many places in the world. And I'm happy to say that some people there have said my work was helpful to them, where people who are experiencing hallucinations and want to talk with other people who are having them. They share ideas about what's been useful to them. And many of those folks have been able to transition from a space in which they felt more confined by the kinds of imaginal eruptions that were going on, to being able to have dialogical relations that also take into account times when a person doesn't want that to be able to happen and needs to be able to distance from it in order to attend to other things like work or family, etc. So I would recommend looking into hearing voices for a lot of wonderful work.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good to see you.
Who's next with a question? Shall I pick next one for a question?
I can ask the question.
Taylor, please.
Thank you for your time. I got the book, Stefano. So
Good. Good.
the book, and thank you. Yeah, I'm really moved to hear some of your story, and maybe this is a small question, but my intrigue was so piqued at these stolen copies of Suicide in the Soul, and I would just be so curious to hear your thought or interpretation around that, Mary.
I think it was a text that people desperately needed. It turned out they had been, I finally got a copy from, it was either New York or North Carolina, I forget which one. It was before Suicide in the Soul was reprinted, so there were very rare, there were very few copies around. Right now, it has been easy to get for many years. But like if you have a friend or a colleague who's dealing with suicidal thoughts, this book is really an accompaniment. It's a profound book, I think. So I think when people took it out, you don't just take out a book on suicide for no reason. Let's face it. You're involved in the issue as a person directly or as somebody who cares about somebody. So I think people needed the book and they needed to hang on to it. That's my thought. Thank you for the question.
You.
I guess I might ask then what sort of imagination you have about the relationship that people have with your books now. Like, especially, I just am considering the privilege that I have to like access, right? I've just ordered this book instantly now. It will be here Saturday. And yeah.
Well, that's very sweet. You know, it's very dear that Stefano has reached back to bring these books forward. And I hope people who can make use of them do. You know, books are odd in terms of sometimes you write something that you really care a lot about, and not that many people access it at the beginning, but sometimes more people do, and sometimes people who take it in a really important way. And so I've been not good about publicizing any of my books. I'm a shy person, so I like to read and write, but I don't like to publicize. So I'm grateful for Stefano that he created the event, because otherwise it would be happening in a very silent way. Thank you.
We have a question from Prashant. Sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly.
No, it's pretty much as you already pronounced. So that's Prashant. Thank you, Stefano. Hello, Mary. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. You know, especially in regards to your experiences, just as Dr. Jung had confrontation with the unconscious. And I guess the credit also goes to Stefano for really coming up with these great questions and pulling all the information from you. I was curious about what you mentioned earlier about you know, liberation being not necessarily individual. You mentioned that it is also about the liberation of others. Could you
Yes.
elaborate more on this? I mean, how
Yeah.
could one be not liberated unless others are liberated.
Yeah. Liberation psychology comes out of liberation theology. And in liberation theology, there's a critique that the self should not be a more important term than the other. This is very interesting because, of course, in kind of Euro-American psychology, we hear most about the self without much consideration about the other. And so that can lead to our thinking that we're getting our house in order by virtue of certain standards that we're constructing, while not really looking at how we're conducting our life in other domains. And one thing that we didn't get to speak about was the work I'm doing now, which is turning more toward ancestors. So in the United States, if you're white and you have ancestors who have been here for some centuries, your ancestors were involved in genocide or chattel slavery or both, or the white privilege that came out of those. And so opening to those realities also calls for responsibility, calls for some form of ancestral reparations, or even perhaps reparations in the present. So in this sense, a person could be thinking, well, I go to meditate, I'm nice to my dog, I'm a pretty good parent. But meanwhile, I'm involved perhaps in work that's polluting the environment. I'm living off of a lot of privilege that I haven't returned yet to the commons. So when Freire and others talk about liberation is something that is a social act, that one has to be liberated in conjunction with others, that puts a particular demand that we see what are the effects of our living on others and on other living forms, and to take account of that.
Thank you, Mary. We have time for one more question before we have to say good night or good afternoon. Tess.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, Tess. Good to see you.
You too. I wanted to ask you about if you could give some ideas on how would you use imaginal approaches in a political setting. There are so many small communities that are very divided right now, and I'm just curious how to bring people together and talk about these things and have people take it seriously and actually get somewhere with it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's interesting. I was asked by a Jungian group in North Carolina before, I think it was the 2016 election. And what we did there was use public conversation practices. So it was not so imaginally based, but it would be borrowing the careful listening to other people, the being able to ask curious generative questions. So in very small groups where there were people from red and blue persuasions, there were certain guidelines that got established. First of all, what were things that you didn't want people who had opposite perspectives or different perspectives to say about your own perspective? How were we going to use our speech with each other? What is the difference between leading questions and questions that really have curiosity to them? One way that we began was allowing people time to talk about their experiences of being children and elections, and what it was like for them experiencing their parents involved in these issues. So we would begin at far distance from the present and trying to listen to each other, develop relationships with each other, that were rather independent of where the rubber hits the road in the present. And you know, these kinds of conversations were derived from, in Boston, a group of women, I think, as you know, who were anti-abortion and pro-abortion activists about 20 years ago when there were abortion clinic murders in Boston. And the idea was to have very, very structured conversations that wouldn't necessarily facilitate change about what anybody was thinking or believing, but would enhance mutual understanding, that that's the place you go toward. So that isn't really imaginal, but it is taking the receptivity to the other, the decentering up of one's viewpoint, the approaching with curiosity, you know, very seriously. And may we employ these in the years to come in the United States. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mary, the last question is for me, but is a question that everyone could ask you. What are you working on?
Well, thank you. I'm
What is
working on
baking?
Yeah, I'm working on a book called White Work, Radical Genealogy as a Pathway to Racial Reparations. And I'm trying, I had a dream of Donald Trump coming into my house and taking all my family history and photographs across many generations and ripping them up. This was a dream. And the point was, you know, we're in a struggle here about where American history begins. Does it begin after the Civil War? Does it begin after the American Revolution, or does it begin in 1619 with slavery? And so I'm trying to track back my own family and have been able to do so to 1608. And I'm trying to look at how whiteness, how people began to identify as white in the Virginia colony where they were living, and then take up issues along the way, coming to about 1930. One of the most interesting things I've discovered, having been a Quaker by discernment, which means I joined the Quakers, was that there were Quakers in both sides of my family, which I didn't know, and that they enslaved people. So I've written a chapter which is about to be published on the 100 years that Quakers were involved in slave trafficking and enslaving before they became abolitionists. So really a portrait in how can we have very deep values, in this case of simplicity and peace and equality, and yet participate in institutions like slavery. How do we bear hypocrisy and complicity, really? So that's what I'm working on now. I'm completely into it. Ask me in 2 years and we'll take a dive.
We will invite you back in 2 years,
Thank you.
even soon. And yeah, we really live in an age of hypocrisy, right? And it resonates with me so much about what Stefan Zweig, Joseph wrote, and of course Jung wrote about the beginning of the 20th century, and now what we could see.
Yes.
The beginning of the 21st century, Jung wrote this amazing paper after the catastrophe, but perhaps we should really take care of another catastrophe.
Yes.
And on a positive note, buy the book.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it.
We had a lovely night, Mary. Thank you. I think those in Europe can go to bed super relaxed. It was like a lullaby, a beautiful lullaby, beautiful story. Thank you for your engagement, for what you gave to the field, and you keep giving. We are so happy we had time with you tonight. Good night, everyone. See you in a month with Dr. Lee Mattison from Pacifica. We will talk about IA. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.